All right, welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Nelson and I'm with the City of Austin Resource Recovery, and we're going to be talking about multifamily composting. I'll go ahead and start the presentation. All right. So I'll start with some background information. We've been working on multifamily composting for a couple of years now, and some of the things that we've done so far, starting in 2021, we started a pilot where we tested composting at multifamily properties in Austin, a few volunteer properties that wanted to try it out and gave us information, and so that we could find out kind of what worked, what didn't, what best practices were. And we published a report on the findings of that pilot. And then in the fall of 2022, we had the first round of these stakeholder meetings where we shared the information that we learned from that pilot project and asked for feedback on what general thoughts were about composting at multifamily properties. And I'll also say, when I say multifamily properties, I mean properties with 5 or more residential units. And these properties do not receive City of Austin services. They contract for waste and recycling and composting services through the private market. So we had about 4 of these public stakeholder meetings where we took in feedback, and we had a survey for residents of multifamily properties. And we used all of that information and developed a first draft of this ordinance that proposes requirements for multifamily properties to provide composting. So that's the draft that we'll be talking about today and presenting. And this is going to, launch this second phase of these stakeholder meetings where we'll get feedback from this first draft, and then we'll use the feedback from this meeting and from our online feedback portal, and we'll develop a draft 2. And again, continue to receive feedback. And then once we have another more finalized draft after we've received this feedback, the next step will be to take that to the Zero Waste Advisory Commission, URO committee, and URO stands for Universal Recycling Ordinance. And the Zero Waste Advisory Commission is, if you're not familiar, is a commission of volunteers who provide counsel with direction about, or with who talk to council and give feedback about zero waste related issues. And so there's a committee of 3 members who focus specifically on the Universal Recycling Ordinance, which is the ordinance that we're talking about here, that we're proposing amendments for. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that ordinance includes here in a minute. And then after that, it will go to the entire Zero Waste Advisory Commission, who will vote to support it or not. And then the final step to make an amendment real is to go to City Council for a vote. All right. So I'll give a little bit of information about that first phase of stakeholder feedback and what we heard, so that we can all be kind of on the same footing if you weren't at any of those meetings. So some of the things that we heard from residents who we talked to were that convenient access to composting was something people wanted. There are a few options out there for composting right now, but they generally involve having to go drop off your compostable material somewhere. And so people really felt that having that be as convenient as your trash service would really help people be able to use it more easily. And another piece that we heard a lot of feedback about was education. People wanted to make sure that people understood how to use the service, that the correct materials were being put in the bins, and that leads to, concerns about contamination. So people were concerned that if they didn't have enough education, if they weren't familiar enough, they might be putting the wrong types of materials in a compost bin and potentially creating a product that couldn't be used. And so education is something people really wanted to make sure that was present so that people could know how to use it properly. And then costs were a concern as well. During the pilot, we did gather information about how much the cost was to the properties themselves, but then there was also concern about how those costs might be passed on to residents and kind of what that actual bill would look like on somebody's rent and how much it would cost. And then flexibility was something that we heard a lot from property managers, wanted to make sure that any requirements had some sort of flexibility built in. And in Austin, there's a lot of different multifamily properties, and there's a lot of variety in what these properties look like, anything from as few as 5 units to sometimes hundreds of units. And this includes apartments, condos, townhomes, mobile home communities, assisted living communities. So there's concern that maybe, there isn't always going to be one solution that works for all of these, broad ranging types of communities. And so making sure that there's some sort of waiver or exception if certain requirements can't be met. And we gave out a survey to get feedback specifically from residents. And from those surveys, we saw overall residents were enthusiastic or in favor of having some sort of composting service or composting access. And we heard some of the same concerns that we heard in the meetings, and that just included these same issues of contamination and education. People really wanted to make sure that their neighbors knew how to do it right. And then, just questions about, is this going to make a mess? Is this going to add to any sort of, smells or rodent issues at the community? So we took all this feedback and that's what we used to develop this first draft. All right, so next I'll give an overview of the Universal Recycling Ordinance that exists today. And this is an ordinance that's been in effect since 2012, and it requires recycling at multifamily and commercial properties. And it also requires organics diversion at food permitted businesses. This ordinance requires that any recycling and organics diversion be convenient to access to employees and residents. Signs and education are required. Signs have to be posted showing what materials can be accepted in the recycling and composting, and education is mandatory for employees and tenants. These properties also are required to submit a report to the city once a year, letting us know how they're meeting these requirements. And then lastly, this whole ordinance is enforced by a Class C misdemeanor. So what we're going to share with you is an amendment to this existing ordinance. So that means that those existing requirements would apply to this amendment. And so some of the key ones there are those education, sign, and reporting requirements that already exist in the ordinance would apply to any amendment to this ordinance. All right, so now is the exciting part, is the actual proposed amendments. All right, so this new section is kind of the most important part here. And this would require that all properties with 5 or more residential units provide tenants and employees access to on-site composting services. And when we say on-site composting services, we mean where materials are collected in a bin, just like trash and recycling, and taken off-site for processing. So not, food waste being turned into compost on the property, but it's collected in a bin and taken off-site. All right, in this next section, the yellow here is what will be added to the existing text, and the rest of the text here is already in the code. And this section, the amendment would state that properties that were mentioned in that last section, those multifamily properties, would be required to collect organics material and provide containers that have the capacity to keep them from overflowing. So they must be big enough and collected often enough that if someone is wanting to put their material in the bin, it would be not overflowing. And then education, this, again, same here, yellow is new, everything else is already in the code. And this would just add to the existing education requirement that composting and organics diversion information be included in the required education, and that required education is already required every year, and then within 30 days of move-in or a new hire, or within 30 days of a big change to what's being collected or accepted. And then this is just kind of a reiteration, but I really want to emphasize this. There is a lot of existing code and rules that would apply to these amendments. So we're not proposing these things be changed. These are things that already exist and would apply to this new part that's being added. And that includes those education requirements, this annual report that is already required. So now these properties would also have to include the composting services in that report. And then the ordinance already required that services provided, recycling and composting services provided, be just as convenient as trash. And then signs are already required for composting containers, and these have to show what is accepted in those containers. And then waivers, the department's administrative rules already include a process for waivers for properties who can't meet certain requirements of the ordinance, and that would apply to this amendment too. And then the code also has in place a 1-year implementation period, and this means that properties have 1 year after the ordinance goes into effect before the city starts enforcing it. So this gives properties 1 year to get up to speed with the requirements. And then lastly, that enforcement piece that I already mentioned, this ordinance is already enforced through a Class C misdemeanor. All right, so that's it. And this next part here is the how to get involved. So how to provide your feedback. So we have a Speak Up Austin page, and this will include a survey of sorts. This gives you opportunity to provide feedback on every part of this proposed amendment. On this site, you can also see the actual draft and as well as some other backup information resources. And it sort of includes an overview of description of all of that's being proposed, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint that you're seeing here with more information. And so that's the website. There's a QR code there. Selene is also going to post this link in the chat so that you can actually click on it. And we really want to hear your input. We want to hear things that you like, things that you don't like, things that we missed. And we want to, for you to share this with your friends, colleagues, neighbors. You all who are here with us today or watching this later are super involved. And so please, encourage your neighbors and friends to be involved too. And it's really important because this information on this Speak Up Austin page that we get is what we're going to use to develop the next draft. So we need to hear from you. All right. So we'll move on to Q&A now. Let me stop sharing. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions if there's anything that you didn't understand. If you need me to go back to a slide or anything, please feel free to ask away.
And again, in case you missed it at the beginning of our session, you can do a written form in the Q&A box. That's right next to the chat. Yay. Okay, great. We have one question. And then you're also welcome to just flag us and we can let you speak and voice your question or your comment to the group.
All right, so Walker has asked here, why do we want to do this and who does it benefit? And that's a really great question. So one thing that I didn't mention is that the city of Austin has a zero waste goal, and that goal is to get to zero waste by 2040. And we've done a lot of studies about where is waste coming from in Austin, and about 75% of Austin residents live in multifamily properties. those other 25% who live in single family properties, I'm sorry, it's like 60-40. Anyway, more than half of residents live in multifamily properties, but that other percentage that live in single family properties get the city of Austin's collection service, and that includes composting service. But most multifamily residents do not have this composting service. And we've also found that about 30% of the waste going to landfills right now is compostable waste that could have been composted. So this helps reduce the amount of material going to landfill. It gives multifamily residents the opportunity to more conveniently compost in a similar way that single family residents can. So it helps our zero waste goal, helps multifamily residents who want to be able to contribute to that reduction in waste. All right, and Caitlin asks, what is the recommended gallon per unit? So we did this pilot, and one of the things we tested was, about how much compost was being generated. And we found that the average that properties were of service that properties were providing to their residents came out to about a little over 1 gallon per unit. And that service was, generally adequate, but it came in a range. Some properties provided a little bit less, some provided a little more. And so, yeah, but the average was about 1 gallon. So if we were to recommend something, I think that would be a good place to start, and then kind of adjust from there based on, how much that property is using. All right. Okay, Kaiba has her hand up. I'm going to let you ask your question.
Hello. Thank you for the overview. Thank you for putting this together. I'm just looking through the current ordinance to try to find those other sections that you mentioned that aren't reflected in the changes. And so I had a question about, I know there is a section in there about location, and I was just hoping you could give me which part of the ordinance that's under, so I could take a look at that. But I did notice that in terms of the signage, that it requires the sign to have the arrows chasing each other symbol, and I just would flag that as probably not an appropriate signage for composting. So, I would just suggest that it would probably be best to make clear what is required for recycling versus composting, so there's not confusion there. And I guess just a comment also on the capacity issue. I do think that a minimum capacity per unit should be established, and that was, of course, part of the recommendations from the URO committee and the FOLS WAC. And I think that's important because without some minimum, you're putting the full burden on residents to report problems and then have a change made. So yeah, the couple comments there and a question on the section.
Yeah, well, thank you for your comments. And to answer your first question about kind of where in the code some of those other things are. So on the Speak Up Austin page, there is a document section, and in that document section, there is a document for this slide deck. The slide deck that's posted on Speak Up Austin has about 5 or 6 additional slides that I didn't include here because those slides just have the exactly what you're asking for, but I just didn't want to include in this PowerPoint because it's, just lines of existing code and rules, but it's all there so you can see it. And it includes, those different bullets. It shows the source of the code for each of those. So that should help you find things a little bit better.
All right, thanks. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah. Did I get all of, did I answer? Was there any other part that was a question? Sorry.
No, I do see here the term recycling or compostables or organics. I guess I would just say it still says that that the signage needs to include the chasing arrows symbol. So I would just reiterate, I think that needs to be clarified, that that's for recycling, because otherwise you're going to end up with people throwing non-compostable things in the compost. And I think we all know that the biggest challenge really is avoiding contamination.
Yeah, definitely. That is not the intention, is not to have recycling symbols on compost. All right. So we had a couple of other questions pop up in the Q&A. So let me go through those. Yes. Okay. So we had a question about, did any of the pilot properties collect compostables for on-site composting or use? Have any properties expressed interest in doing so? And so, no, that's a good question. The pilot participants, none of those collected compostables for on-site processing. The material was all hauled off-site to a processing or to some processing facilities. And no, we haven't really had a lot of interest in doing that. But I think one of the challenges is just, it depends on the type of property, right? Is where to do that exactly. Let's see here. All right, I think we've answered all the questions that are in the Q&A. But we have a couple of other questions in the chat. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to read these all out loud so we can make sure that we're inclusive of all of our people who might be watching the recording of this later. So forgive me if I sound redundant. All right, so one person asked, the residents that you surveyed, were they aware that they would end up being charged back for the services, which would technically increase monthly payments and affect pest this would eventually affect pest control and possibly increase those costs as well. So the properties that participated in the pilot, those properties were reimbursed for the charges. So residents did not pay for those services during the pilot at all. If the properties chose to continue doing the service after the pilot was over, then properties, could choose to do that. And then, they could choose to bill their residents however they do business. But during the pilot period, the city covered the costs essentially. And yes, we did hear feedback from property managers about the potential to add to, pest control if that was something that people were concerned about too. All right, we've got one more question here. Kathleen asks, I'm curious about whether there would be limits on how much residents can be charged monthly for compost services. I'm more than happy to pay to get compost, but not everyone is, and not if it's exorbitant or much more than trash. So this was something that was recommended in the Euro committee recommended that we look at limiting this, and this is something that we are looking into, but we just don't know yet how we can include that. So that has been a recommendation. All right, and then another one, another recommendation was that compost should be collected in bins, not large dumpsters. Does staff see a problem with including that requirement in the code? We did not include that requirement simply because that type of specificity is not in the code currently for recycling, and we, decided not to be that prescriptive. We observed during the pilot that only bins were offered. All of the properties that participated in the pilot, when they reached out to composting haulers, they were only offered bins dumpsters were not even an option. And it's not something we've seen happen at all. So we didn't see the need to, specifically make that a requirement, because it seems to be the only option on the market right now is bins. We definitely think that it makes sense to, recommend that as a best practice, but it doesn't seem to be even an option at the moment.
We've also heard significant concerns over space. And so trying to fit a dumpster in a property seems unlikely given the competition for parking spaces. Typically, we see composting dumpsters attached to restaurants or some sort of commercial facility, not a residential, multifamily residential property.
Right. The haulers differentiate what type of service they want to provide based on who their customer is. They know when they're being contacted, whether it's a residential property or a commercial. And we've seen they're only offering dumpsters to commercial restaurant customers. All right, so we've got another question about how often would the bins be picked up? So the bins would be picked up at least once a week. That's what the requirement is for trash, and that would be the same for this. And that's a state law. That's not something the city controls. And as far as concerns about mess inside the hallway, so this would be collected in this same way that trash is collected. So most properties, there's a trash dumpster or carts, recycling dumpster or carts that's somewhere centrally located, usually in a parking lot or parking garage. And residents would take that out. Some properties offer valet services where the either bags or trash cans are placed out in the hallways. And this is something that could potentially be that composting can be collected the same way. And as far as mess, one thing to keep in mind is that the material that's being generated is exactly the same. People are throwing away food waste in their trash right now. So if you're collecting trash in the hallways, then you're collecting the same material that you would be for composting. So it shouldn't be too different as far as what's going out. All right, we've got one more question. I frequently hear concerns about carts wandering off or otherwise going missing. Do you have any recommendations to prevent that? I'm not sure about that. I mean, I have heard that too. Yeah, I don't have any recommendations for that I can think of.
Yeah, that might be more of a property management company solution that can be provided, given that they have a bit more expertise in terms of general security for their properties.
Yeah, somebody suggests adding addresses to the carts. That certainly doesn't hurt. Keeps things from getting mixed up at least. And feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'm trying to make sure I caught everything in the chat, but possible I missed things. All right, we've got one more question. Would the increase in trucks picking up the composting add to pollution from gas operated vehicles? Yeah, so haulers would create routes that are as efficient as possible. That's what they do for recycling now. They tend to kind of stick in neighborhoods, and they want to reduce obviously the costs associated with hauling, and doing so makes makes them want to make the most efficient routes possible. All right, and I'll also add to, please feel free to, send us emails if you, an email if you have any questions. I'll include my email here in the chat as well. If you come up with other questions later on, or if you look through the materials and you feel like you're still missing something, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'll give another minute or two to see if anybody has any more questions while we're here, since we have a little bit more time left, but yeah, all right, it looks like we do have one more. All right, so this question is, since different compost systems accept different materials depending on size, is there a requirement to have a system that accepts bones, meat, etc.? That's not currently specified in this draft. So if that's something that you think makes more sense and you would like to recommend that, then you can definitely include that in your feedback. Because right now the way that it's written, let me find that text. It says that they have to collect organic materials. Yes. One person asked, would material go to organics by Gosh? So we have an open market in Austin, so multifamily and commercial properties can select whatever service provider they would like. There are several service providers in Austin. Some of them do deliver to organics by Gosh, but not all of them. So some of the material would end up there, but it's up to the properties which hauler they would like, and different haulers use different processors. Oh, hey, Eva, did you put your hand back up? You can unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to speak.
Yeah. No, you're good.
Well, yeah, I guess first I did look through the presentation, and maybe I'm just scanning too fast, but I couldn't find the section where it specified the location, and I do think that co-location is key, because it needs to be, that was kind of the whole point, it needs to be just as convenient, and I believe you that it's in there, but I just also want to see it.
Yes, we will find that for sure.
Thank you. And then I guess I'll add it in the comments on Speak Up, but one of the other recommendations that we did make at SWAC was to specify the materials so that there could be a standard. So, especially as renters, you do maybe have a tendency to move from property to property a little bit more, and not having to relearn what is allowed to go in your composting, I think is important, to have a standard. And I also noticed in the variances that one of the ways that you can have a variance is by having on-site composting. And while I do think the on-site composting is great, it really does not take the place of commercial composting, because you just can't compost all the same things. Most people are not going to compost meat and bones, and oftentimes not even dairy, let alone other kind of compostable takeout containers, pizza boxes, cardboard that has been soiled, all kinds of things that you can compost in commercial composting. So I would suggest that variance for on-site composting maybe should not persist.
Yeah, definitely include that too. I'll just add about the variances and waivers too, that any property that wants a variance or waiver, they do have to request it and provide quite a bit of detail about why it is that they are requesting a waiver, and then the city, approves or denies those waivers based on, the information and evidence provided. So it's not just an automatic sort of a, here's a way to get out, or here's an alternative. It does have to be reviewed and approved.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I mean, I suppose if that were left in there, but you had a requirement for all the materials that have to be accepted, and then, so they have to have on-site composting that covers all the materials, then maybe that would be, I think, a more reasonable alternative. I'm just thinking about, I live in a single family home, and a lot of what goes in our composting is, right now, things like pizza boxes and other takeout containers that are compostable. So, we don't want that stuff going in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll put it in the written comments.
Yeah, thank you. All right, gonna last call for questions. It seems like the question box is dying down a little bit, so I'll give a minute or two to, if anybody has any last minute questions. And really, anything is fair game. And like I said, I know it can be hard to think of things when you've just absorbed information. So I will put my email address in here right now while I'm thinking about it. But it's easy. It's just my name, Elizabeth Nelson at austintexas.gov. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate your attending and asking your questions. We had some really good question discussions, so thank you very much for contributing to that as well. And again, my last sign-off call here is to please provide feedback on the Speak Up Austin and share that link with your friends and neighbors. And we will look forward to hearing your feedback, and please feel free to ask questions. And either through that form or through me. And then please fill out that sign-in survey too, because that is an opportunity also to share your email address if you want to hear about future meetings. This is one of there will be future meetings as well. And if you want to make sure to hear about them, sign in, say you would like to receive emails from me, and give us your email address. And I promise we will only we will only use that email address to let you know about these types of meetings. So we will not be bombarding your inbox, but that is the best way to hear about these meetings, is to share your email address with us. And there is also, on the Speak Up Austin page, is a link to add yourself to our mailing list as well. So if you have friends that want to be involved, you can find that there. All right. Well, thank you all, and have a good rest of your evening.